There is something to be said about losing the physical presence of someone close to you. I think some take the path of dwelling and some avoidance. But it's important to find a middle ground, which includes acknowledgement of the loss. I think it's incredibly unhuman to not experience the grief for the sake of saying that it's only the physical form that is no longer here. While there is truth in that, it's reductive to the action of being called home. That is an experience beyond true comprehension, and we must acknowledge that. On the contrary, dwelling in the sadness by way of sulking is unhealthy. You give up in the name of love, but love's truest gift is that it prevails, but it also pauses and perceives. I like to think of it as if we were singing bowls at different frequencies, and when one frequency is removed, the song just doesn't sound the same. Hello world, I'm your host Kiya, and welcome to Be My Witness, a podcast where we witness life in all its various experiences, to the highs and lows and the in-betweens. Today's episode is a bit intense, I won't lie to you, because we are talking about grief. And grief is something that is a bit challenging to conceptualize, but in this episode I try to give you a little piece of grief, and it may make you cry, because it did make me cry. So be prepared for that. If that's not something that you can tap into at this moment, feel free to stop the video or stop the episode and come back later when you have some time. I'll be discussing how grief is a process, not a linear experience, and some different ideas to think of it to help you through your journey, and a little bit of my experience with grief as well. And so I thank you for being here. Let's get into it. So, dealing with grief, no matter the impact, is one of the most sometimes incomprehensible experiences to go through, because a lot of times it doesn't fall into the category of making sense. And this world doesn't really give you a lot of space or time to process grief. And a lot of us keep moving forward even though our heart yearns to stop. Today I'm speaking on grief, specifically when it pertains to the death of a loved one, because I had a beautifully heartfelt conversation about that same thing, and it really inspired me to speak to it as a whole, and also give other people who may have experienced or are experiencing the same pain, the same circumstance. I recently saw a video. I'm going to assume they were like a spiritual person or someone very into spirituality. And they were kind of encouraging the viewer to kind of bypass the idea that their loved one is gone because they've passed. And while I hold partial belief in that when someone passed, it doesn't mean that they're like totally gone. They just transition into the spiritual. They go to the ancestors. They become your spirit team, your spirit guides, or they're reincarnated into another lifetime. I don't think It's healthy, though, to bypass the grief and the pain that comes with losing a loved one or someone that you cared about very deeply, because you're not really allowing yourself to have the human experience. And unfortunately, grieving is a big part of the human experience, because I believe that grief and love are deeply tied together. So if we're here to love, that means we're also here to grieve. And there's simply no need to rush the grief and the grieving process, because there is no end. I believe we have a lifetime to process the grief, because as long as we live and make new memories, the ones we loved won't be there to experience them with us anymore, at least not in the physical. And that grief is never ending. But I choose not to look at it in a somber way. It's more so a place of contentment and being okay with knowing that this pain will be here no matter what. I don't have to rush to get to the bottom of it, or to quote unquote get over it, because it's a lifetime. It's a lifelong pain that as long as I live, I will carry with me. And there's a sense of peace in that. Another thing I think that a lot of people are familiar with, that I reframe for myself while processing grief, are the 5 stages of grief. So the 5 stages of grief is a concept created by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. It was originally made to describe terminally ill patients' reactions to their own death, and not necessarily how one processes the grief of a loved one, which I think is really important to recognize, because there is a difference between confronting one's own mortality versus losing a loved one and still having to live a life. And I remember shortly after my brother passed, I was trying to find connection, find people to talk about it with, because it was something new that I never experienced. And I had a professor who also had a sibling pass, and so I went to her, and damn, I knew that this episode was gonna be emotional, but I'm trying to still speak pretty clearly and not cry. But so bear with me. But this was really on my heart, and if anything, that just shows me how much this will mean and how much this is needed. So I went to her, and I was telling her, I think I'm in this stage, and I don't know, I'm just going through a lot, and, really just expressing myself to her. And she told me, baby, there is no stage. There is no timeline to grief. There is no one way you're going to experience, or you're going to go through the stages one by one. It's a whole process, and you'll go back and forth between each stage. And from then, at that moment, that really, really helped settle me, because I was really confused, honestly. And the fact that she was able to reframe it for me was really special. So shout out to Professor Carmen. I don't know if somehow you end up listening to this, but if you do, shout out Professor Carmen. You real for that. But yeah, the stages of grief. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea of using the stages of grief to relate to experiencing grief of a loved one completely, but I do like the concept that you will experience acceptance throughout your journey of grieving. Um, my experience with grieving a loved one, very close family member, starts when I was very young. I was 10 when my grandmother passed away, and she was a really pivotal figure in my life, or a really prominent figure in my life. And losing her, especially so young, was really jarring because at the time, the idea that someone in my family could pass away just never crossed my mind. Like, I just never thought about that. But what 10-year-old would, you know? I describe it as my worst nightmare lived, a nightmare that I didn't even know I had. But the reason why it hit so much harder for me at the time, because a year and some change before she passed, my mom was diagnosed with cancer and beat its ass. So I knew we were fighters, and I thought we were unbreakable. And no one had ever talked with me about death. And at the time, I didn't want to believe it was true, so I avoided its reality for a long time. Not only because I was 10, like, I just never really knew how to even talk about it, because as far as I knew, other kids were not experiencing this instance. Like, a lot of, like, people around me were not going through the same thing, and I didn't really know how to talk about it with them or even adults, because a lot of times adults use their adult brain to talk about things, and they try to, like, at least from my perspective, they'll try to, like, rationalize it or try to not make you sad. But even honestly, anybody talking about grief is like, they're always trying not to make you sad, but it's kind of like it's kind of like breathing air and not breathing. Like, it's kind of like it's kind of like standing in the rain and not getting wet. Like, you can't really do that, like, with no umbrella. Like, so I just kind of felt in the middle of that. So I didn't talk about it for a long time, because with that experience, I didn't know how. I would like to think that me now would embrace it, in a sense, not embrace it like with joy, but like embrace it for what it is. Um, the only thing that I wish that I had done is, like, look at my grandma's face one last time and just really embrace that experience as well. I don't necessarily think of it as a regret or anything. It's just more of like, if I could turn back time and, like, not necessarily relive it, but put myself in that experience now, as something that I would change about my process. But I bring it up to encourage anyone who may be on the path, or maybe about to experience a funeral of a loved one, to, even if it's through teary eyes, just take in what they look like one last time, and be with them in that moment. Like I mentioned before, I also lost my brother, who passed away about 9 years after my grandma passed away. And I hadn't begun to truly feel the grief until about last year. Similar to before with processing my grandmother's passing, I didn't really talk about it much, and I used the peace and knowing that he was okay, from his situation, to kind of detach or bring myself from it, or from experiencing the pain. But when I found myself trying to connect with other people, it felt like I was holding on to a bomb, because no matter how much I wanted to bypass the pain, my connection to my brother is crucial to the person I am today. And not talking about it hurt more than I knew it would. So every day, I process it a little more and more, but I do recognize it as a painful experience. And I equate it to a piece of my heart being gone. I know that I'm able to speak about it now, even through the tears, because I allow myself to take my time. I allow myself to take my time, knowing that his presence, his energy is still here, especially when it comes to music. If you knew my brother, you know he really loved music. And so when I hear certain songs, especially when they come on the radio or randomly, I like to think of him waving to me or saying hi. And I try to no longer carry that grief like a bomb that could explode at any moment. Instead, a part of my story, I can carry it more gentle because I'm not afraid to go to it. And I allow it to come up in conversation. I allow it to be the centerpiece of my project. I allow it to be a part of my story and not something I have to be shameful of or hide or pretend like it didn't happen or try to bypass it by saying, well, he's still here spiritually, because it is painful. It is painful. And I think that it's perfectly human to acknowledge that. Thank you for still listening. This is a topic that I know many of us shy away from or won't even allow ourselves to go or talk about or experience. So if you're still here, thank you, not only for being here with me, but being here for yourself. And really taking the time to sit in this emotion and sit in this feeling. And yeah, I thank you, truly. Grief truly is, in a painfully beautiful way, the grief and the heartbreak are in love. To have love to give, but nowhere to put it. That's what lies at the core of the tears. In the moments you forget they're gone, but are reminded it's all in love. But also recognize your grief as pain and see that it bleeds and it yearns to be felt and seen. And I want you to know that it's better to know it than to avoid it. Grief and love are spiritually intertwined because they have a lot of similarities in the way that they're sometimes hard to explain, and they sometimes don't even have a reason or need a reason. They just are. And the same way that love has like joy and bliss is the same way that grief has pain and heartbreak. It's inherent almost, and it's really important to acknowledge that it hurts because then you know it and you can embrace it without the avoidance or pretending that it's something else or that it's not there at all. And I don't know if it's true, but their lives don't stop at the physical. Anyone that has experienced life with you will forever exist in your memory, and biologically, they exist in you. And I know for me that I love dreams and I love to dream. So when my loved ones visit me in a dream, I hold on extra special to those because they feel like other ways to make new memories with them. So in that, I find that love and the continuation that's embedded in the moments that brings so much pain and grief that feels like suffocation. Even still, there are moments that we can find that bring us peace, that can even bring us joy and happiness, even though we're experiencing something that we can't really grasp, something that's truly never ending, something that's beyond our capacity sometimes. That's another reason why I believe it's important to take it piece by piece and not try to get through the grief necessarily. Not get through the grief, but get over the grief. Because I don't think those two things can exist at the same time. You can't grieve and get over it. Because, like, I believe grief is a lifelong process, and it's okay to take it piece by piece and even have moments where you're not actively in it. You're still experiencing your life. You're still experiencing joy and happy moments. Not letting the grief lead you to stop living life, but also not letting the grief allow you to run away from it either. Just finding your balance, finding how much you have the capacity for, and embracing it, allowing it to pass through you. You know, maybe it's not that you pass through grief, but grief passes through you. So my final thoughts on the process of grieving, or the processing of grief, is that just like life, grieving is not linear. You will go in and out of the stages, and acceptance doesn't mean that you'll never feel sad about it again. Allow yourself to process what you need in that particular moment, not attempting to rush it because it is lifelong. As long as you live, you will grieve, but grieving is an act of love. So be gentle with yourself and your loved ones experiencing grief, and people out in the world who may be experiencing grief that don't share it outwardly. Be gentle with them, because at the most inconvenient times, grief can be passing through them. Thank you for being here. Until next time, peace.